The garage door came down at exactly 9:50 p.m. That moment would become the final confirmed time anyone saw Nancy Guthrie alive. Just hours later, at 2:28 a.m., she was gone. There was no sign of forced entry, no witness who reported hearing a struggle, no scream that pierced the quiet of the night. The only trace left behind was a doorbell camera, and a masked figure who appeared to know exactly where that camera was positioned. The person walked directly toward it and disabled it before the night was over. What you are about to watch is not simply a story about confirmed facts. It is a closer look at the space between the official narrative and what the documented evidence actually reveals. Authorities publicly stated that the family had been cleared. Yet the vehicle Tommaso Scianni used to drive Nancy home that night remained inside a forensic evidence lot for weeks after that announcement. Investigators continued processing it, treating it as part of an active investigation even after the clearance was issued. Meanwhile, a veteran journalist with more than 3 decades of experience reported that a senior law enforcement source privately identified a possible prime suspect. According to that journalist, the source never changed that assessment, not once, even after the public clearance was made. And the security cameras on the property tell another troubling detail. It wasn't just a single camera that stopped working that night. Multiple cameras were disabled, one after another, in a pattern that suggested the person responsible understood the layout of the home and the surveillance system protecting it. The last confirmed individual to see Nancy Guthrie alive was Tommaso Scianni. He had driven her home and remained outside long enough to watch her enter the house. He waited until the garage door fully closed. Then he left. But investigators believe that within the next 41 minutes, something happened inside that home, something no official statement has ever completely explained. At one point, detectives carried out a 3-hour search of Scianni's residence. Evidence bags were removed from the property, and investigators publicly confirmed that the case activity was continuing. Yet only 6 days later, authorities issued a formal statement clearing him. The sheriff later pointed to DNA evidence as the reason behind that decision. But within forensic science, there is an important distinction, one between a match found in a database and a direct DNA comparison between individuals. No official statement has ever fully clarified which of those methods was used in this case. Then there is the physical description released by the FBI of the masked suspect. The description was so broad that it could apply to millions of men. What has never been publicly explained is how that description aligns, or conflicts, with Scianni's own profile. 7 separate details, each one documented, each one preserved in the public record, and yet none of them fully resolved. In this video, we are going to walk through all 7, one by one, using the verified evidence behind every claim. By the time we reach the end, you will understand why, despite an official clearance, the questions surrounding this case continue to persist. If you are new here, this channel covers true crime investigations with a single standard: evidence first. No speculation presented as fact. No dramatization replacing documentation. Everything discussed in this video comes from law enforcement press conferences, court-verified forensic reporting, official FBI releases, and credible journalistic sources. We don't editorialize. We examine. If that is the kind of analysis you want, consider subscribing and turning on the notification bell. Because when new evidence surfaces in this case, you will hear about it here first, examined with the same level of precision. Now let's go back to the beginning, because to understand why these 7 details matter, you first have to understand the exact timeline of events, from the evening of January 31st into the early hours of February 1st, 2026. Everything in this case revolves around a single window of time. 41 minutes. Saturday evening in the Catalina foothills of Arizona, an affluent and quiet stretch of desert hillside just north of Tucson. Homes are spaced far apart. Tall saguaro cacti line the roads. It's the kind of neighborhood where silence is normal, and where even if something unusual happens, the nearest neighbor might never hear it. At 5:32 p.m., Nancy Guthrie, 84 years old, arrived at the home of her daughter Annie. She spent the evening there. Dinner with family, conversation. A completely ordinary night. The kind of night that feels insignificant at the time until it becomes the last one. Later that evening at approximately 9:48 p.m., Annie's husband, Tommaso Shini, Nancy's son-in-law, drove her back to her home. He waited as she went inside. 2 minutes later at 9:50 p.m., the garage door closed. Shini then drove away. That closing garage door marks the last verified moment Nancy Guthrie was confirmed to be alive and inside her home. Everything that follows has been reconstructed using forensic data. At 1:47 a.m., Nancy's doorbell camera at the front entrance went offline. Not because of a malfunction. Investigators say it was deliberately disconnected. Then at 2:12 a.m., a motion sensor detected activity on the property. But because Nancy's security account did not have an active subscription at the time, the device recorded no video footage. 16 minutes later at 2:28 a.m., another signal stopped transmitting, Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker. The cardiac device, which routinely communicated with her cell phone, suddenly went silent. Investigators believe that moment marks the likely time she was removed from the home. That creates the window. From 1:47 a.m., when the camera was disabled, to 2:28 a.m., when the pacemaker signal ended. 41 minutes. Think about what that means. In less than an hour, an 84-year-old woman with a fragile heart, someone who relied on daily medication to survive, was taken from her own home. And whoever carried it out appeared to arrive prepared. According to investigators, the masked individual seen near the property wore gloves, carried a backpack, and had what appeared to be a firearm secured at their hip. The Pima County Sheriff's Department would later classify the incident as a kidnapping. But that raises a series of questions. How does someone know exactly where a security camera is located on a house they've never entered before? How does a person move through a private residential property in the dark, disable multiple devices, and leave the area without triggering a wider neighborhood response? That kind of precision doesn't look like chance. It doesn't look like improvisation. It suggests knowledge. And in criminal investigations, knowledge almost always has a source. Investigators understood that, which is why, in the early days following Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, the focus of the investigation did not initially expand outward. It moved inward, toward the people who had access to the home, toward the individuals who had recently been there, toward the last person confirmed to have seen Nancy alive only hours before that 41-minute window began. The Pima County Sheriff's Department received nearly 18,000 tips and calls in the days after Nancy vanished. Federal agents were brought in from Quantico, analysts, digital forensics specialists, crisis negotiators. Even the director of the FBI commented publicly on the case. Search teams deployed dogs, drones, helicopters, and infrared equipment across the surrounding desert landscape. This was not a routine investigation. The scale of the response reflected the seriousness of what investigators believed the evidence might be pointing toward. And in the middle of all that activity, a name began to surface. Not through internet speculation, not through anonymous posts on social media, but from a senior law enforcement source who reportedly had direct access to the investigation. That source spoke to a veteran journalist, someone with 36 years of experience reporting for CNN, HLN, Court TV, and News Nation. The name mentioned was Tommaso Shini. Now it is important to state clearly. On February 16th, the sheriff publicly announced that Shani and the entire Guthrie family had been cleared. That clearance is official. It is documented. And later in this video, we will examine it in full because every side of this case deserves to be addressed with equal weight. But here is what did not happen after that announcement. The vehicle Shani drove that night did not immediately return home. It remained in a forensic evidence lot for weeks. The journalist's law enforcement source never withdrew their earlier assessment. And several of the forensic questions surrounding the timeline were never publicly clarified. The gap between the public statement and the documented investigative record remained. 7 separate details. Individually, each one could have an explanation. But when they are placed together inside the same 41-minute window, they form the core of the questions that still surround this case today. Individually, each of these details might appear explainable, but when viewed together, they begin to form a pattern, one that no official statement has directly addressed. And that is exactly why we're here. Stay with us because detail number 1 begins where this case itself begins, with a garage door closing at 9:50 p.m. and a 41-minute window that investigators have never fully accounted for. But before you can understand what was taken during the early hours of February 1st, 2026, you first have to understand who Nancy Guthrie was, not simply as a headline or a missing persons case number, but as a person who lived 84 years of a documented, purposeful, deeply rooted life. Nancy Ellen Long was born on January 27, 1942, in Fort Wright, Kentucky, a small community just across the Ohio River from Cincinnati. She later graduated from the University of Kentucky and in December of 1963 married Charles Errol Guthrie. In the early years of their marriage, Nancy followed her husband's engineering career around the world. Charles was a mining engineer, and his work eventually brought the family to Melbourne, Australia. It was there, in December of 1971, that their youngest daughter, Savannah, was born. When Savannah was 2 years old, the family returned to the United States. Not long after, they settled in Tucson, Arizona. Nancy never left. For more than 5 decades, Tucson became the center of her life. She raised 3 children in the desert landscape and, by every account, became the gravitational center of her family. Her son Cameron would go on to become a decorated military pilot, a colonel who flew F-16 fighter jets for 26 years with the Vermont Air National Guard. Her daughter Savannah graduated magna cum laude from the University of Arizona and later became one of the most recognizable figures in American broadcast journalism, serving as co-anchor of NBC's Today Show beginning in 2012. Her daughter Annie followed a different path, becoming a poet, jewelry designer, and educator. She authored a published poetry collection and once served as marketing director for the University of Arizona Poetry Center. Annie later married an Italian-born AP biology teacher named Tommaso Shani, who had lived and worked in Tucson for more than 15 years. 3 children, 3 accomplished lives. And in one way or another, each of those lives had been shaped by the woman who held the family together. In 1988, that center nearly broke. Charles Guthrie died suddenly at the age of 49 from a cardiac event while on a mining exploration trip in Mexico. At the time, Savannah was only 16 years old. The loss devastated the family. Nancy had spent much of her marriage raising her children full-time, but after her husband's death, she made a decision that would reshape the future of her family. She went back to work. Nancy accepted a public relations position at the University of Arizona. The reason was simple. Employees of the university could help their children attend college tuition-free. She held that job from 1990 until 2007, 17 years. not because she was pursuing a corporate career, but because she wanted to build a path forward for her daughters with her own hands. Years later, Savannah would describe her mother as the rock that kept the family together after their father's death. She credited Nancy with encouraging her to pursue journalism, a decision that ultimately shaped the career the world now knows. That is the woman at the center of this case. By 2026, Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. She lived alone in the Catalina foothills, an unincorporated desert hillside community north of Tucson known for its sweeping views of the Santa Catalina Mountains. The area is quiet, isolated. Properties there typically sit on lots larger than an acre. Homes are tucked behind desert vegetation and natural terrain. When night falls, the neighborhood becomes dark and still. Nancy herself described that life in a Today Show segment filmed in November of 2025, just 3 months before she disappeared. She called Tucson wonderful. She spoke about the relaxed pace of life. At one point, she laughed about watching javelinas wander through her yard and eat the plants in her garden. She appeared sharp, engaged, active in her church. But physically, there were limitations. Investigators confirmed early in the case that Nancy had restricted mobility. She relied on daily medication and lived with a pacemaker that continuously communicated with her cell phone. She was not someone who could have simply wandered away from home. Law enforcement made that point clear early in the investigation. The possibility that she had left voluntarily was ruled out within hours of the initial welfare check. From the moment deputies entered her home, the evidence pointed in only one direction. Nancy Guthrie had not left on her own. Her routine made that clear as well. Every Sunday morning, Nancy attended a virtual church service. It was something she rarely missed. But on the morning of February 1st, 2026, she did not appear. A member of the congregation noticed the absence and contacted the family. That single phone call set everything in motion. What investigators would discover when they arrived at Nancy's home in the Catalina foothills changed the nature of the case almost immediately. Within hours, what began as a welfare check became a missing person investigation. And before the sun set that same day, it had escalated into a full federal kidnapping investigation. An 84-year-old woman who had spent her life building a family, supporting a community, and shaping 3 remarkable lives had suddenly vanished. And the 41-minute window that might explain how, and by whom, had already passed in the darkness long before anyone knew to start looking. Sunday morning, February 1st, 2026. Sunday morning in Tucson begins quietly. The desert air is cool, carrying the calm that settles over the Sonoran landscape before the heat of the day arrives. It was the kind of morning Nancy Guthrie usually spent exactly where she was expected to be, sitting in front of her computer, watching a live-streamed church service with a group of friends who gathered virtually every week. But on this particular Sunday morning, something was different. Nancy never joined the call. Her screen stayed dark. The connection never opened. At first, her friends waited, assuming there had simply been a delay. Then they reached out. When they still couldn't reach her, they contacted the family. At 12:15 p.m., deputies from the Puma County Sheriff's Department arrived at Nancy's home in the Catalina foothills. Dispatch records show the call was logged as a welfare check, the type of call that usually ends with an elderly resident opening the door and assuring everyone that everything is fine. But the moment deputies stepped inside the home, the situation changed. According to official statements from the Sheriff's Department, what investigators observed inside the residence was described as very concerning and inconsistent with a voluntary departure. Within hours, the welfare check turned into a missing persons investigation. That investigation quickly evolved into something more serious. The residence was treated as a potential crime scene, and before the sun had even set that same Sunday, homicide investigators had joined the case alongside search teams. The Pima County Sheriff's Department also notified the FBI. That sequence of events is important. Homicide investigators are not typically called to routine welfare checks, and they are not standard responders to most missing persons reports. Their involvement usually signals that the evidence found at a scene is significant enough to suggest the possibility that a life may have been taken. That is what the initial evidence inside Nancy Guthrie's home appeared to indicate. Investigators later confirmed that forensic evidence consistent with Nancy's biological profile had been located near the front entrance of the residence. Subsequent laboratory testing verified that the genetic material belonged to her. Inside the home, deputies also observed something else. Many of Nancy's personal belongings remained exactly where they would normally be. Her medications were still there. Her phone had not been taken. These were items someone planning to leave voluntarily would almost certainly have brought with them. And then there was the doorbell camera mounted near the front entrance. It had not simply stopped working. It had not been damaged by weather or a technical malfunction. Investigators determined that the device had been physically removed from its mount. Deliberately. The exterior of the property appeared to tell its own story as well, although investigators chose not to publicly describe in detail what they observed outside the home, or what those findings might have suggested about what happened near the entrance. But not every expert reviewing the early stages of the investigation remained silent. Forensic investigator Lou Giacalone spoke publicly about the first hours of the crime scene response and raised a concern that has never been formally addressed by authorities. According to his assessment, the number of individuals who were allowed access to the property during those early hours did not appear consistent with standard evidence preservation protocols. In major forensic investigations, the first priority is typically to secure the entire area, not just the residence itself, but the surrounding properties as well. Establishing a controlled perimeter allows investigators to document exactly who enters the scene and when they enter it. Giacalone suggested that this process may not have been followed as strictly as it normally would be. His conclusion was direct. He described the early management of the scene as a significant procedural concern. To date, the Pima County Sheriff's Department has not publicly responded to that criticism. And the issue matters. In forensic investigations, the first few hours are often the most critical. Evidence can degrade quickly. Trace materials can be unintentionally contaminated. When too many people move through a scene before it is fully secured, reconstructing what actually happened becomes far more difficult. If the integrity of the scene was compromised, even unintentionally, it could affect the quality and reliability of the evidence collected there. At the same time investigators were working inside the residence, the digital systems connected to the property were already becoming central to the investigation. The FBI's Operational Technology Division arrived on scene with specialized equipment used for video forensic analysis. One of the analysts involved had previously worked on the Brian Koberger investigation. Agents were seen carrying Pelican-style equipment cases into the residence, and when they left the property, observers noted that they were transporting a large diagram that appeared to display human height measurements. Sources familiar with the investigation indicated that the diagram was likely being used to compare the physical dimensions of the masked figure captured on the doorbell camera footage with the known measurements of the property and surrounding structures. 11 days later, on February 12th, the FBI released a formal suspect profile. That profile was based entirely on forensic analysis of the limited footage recovered from the doorbell camera system. The suspect description released by investigators was precise in some ways, but broad in others. Male, approximately 5 feet 9 to 5 feet 10 inches tall, average build, a black mustache visible beneath the edge of a mask. The individual was seen carrying a black 25-liter Ozark Trail hiker backpack with reflective straps. Investigators also noted the presence of a firearm secured in a holster, positioned near the center of the waist, an unusual carry position that caught the attention of forensic analysts reviewing the footage. The same person was observed approaching the front doorbell camera. At first, a gloved hand reached out toward the lens, attempting to block the view. But that wasn't the only action captured. After the initial attempt, the individual stepped off the porch, reached down into the landscaping near the entrance, picked up shrubbery from the garden, and then used the plant material to further obscure the camera from below. That sequence reveals something important. Covering a camera with a hand is instinctive. It's a quick reaction. But stepping away, retrieving material from the yard, and returning to conceal the lens more effectively, that's deliberate. It's a second step taken after the first one didn't feel sufficient. And the second step only happens if the person believes the camera is still recording. Investigators interpreted that behavior as a sign that the individual understood how security cameras operate and was adjusting in real time when the first attempt didn't fully block the device. In other words, this did not appear to be someone acting on pure impulse. It looked like someone who arrived with at least some understanding of surveillance systems. One piece of evidence quickly became what Sheriff Chris Nanos later described as one of the most promising leads in the investigation. The backpack. The 25-liter Ozark Trail hiking pack seen in the footage is a product sold exclusively through Walmart stores. Within days of the FBI releasing the suspect description, investigators began reviewing surveillance footage from Walmart locations throughout Tucson and nearby areas. Walmart also provided authorities with purchase records for every Ozark Trail backpack sold in those stores during the months leading up to Nancy's disappearance. Every transaction, every location, every method of payment. It created a trail investigators could follow. At the same time, another element of the case began to emerge: ransom communications. Multiple notes were sent directly to media outlets, including TMZ, KOLD News 13, and KGUN 9. The initial message demanded $6 million to be paid in cryptocurrency. Two separate deadlines were included in the communication, both passed without any confirmed payment. Later, a third message surfaced. This one referenced a different cryptocurrency and contained language that TMZ described as threatening and graphic in nature. All of the communications were forwarded to the FBI. Authorities confirmed that investigators were taking the messages seriously, but the origin of the notes has never been publicly identified. It remains unclear whether they came from whoever removed Nancy from her home, or from someone attempting to exploit the attention surrounding the case. What investigators did confirm from the very beginning was this: the evidence inside and outside Nancy Guthrie's home pointed clearly toward a forced removal. Not a fall, not a medical episode, not a voluntary disappearance. Someone came to that house in the middle of the night. They arrived prepared. They wore gloves. They carried equipment. And they appeared to know enough about the property to move through it in the darkness without immediately alerting anyone nearby. But the central question investigators began asking in those early hours was not simply who could have done this. It was who knew enough to do it. And as the first week of the investigation came to a close, the focus of the inquiry began to shift, away from the broader search of the surrounding desert, and toward a much more specific line of investigation: Because there is a principle in criminal investigations that investigators almost always follow. The last person known to have seen the victim alive is the first person investigators attempt to eliminate. Not because suspicion is automatic, but because logic requires investigators to start with what is known and work outward from there. And what is known in this case begins with a garage door closing at 9:50 p.m. on January 31st, 2026, and a man named Tommaso Shini driving away into the Tucson night. Pause there for a moment, because what follows is not speculation. It is a documented sequence of events that investigators themselves have confirmed. Tommaso Shini is 50 years old. He was born in Italy and has lived in Tucson for more than 15 years. He works as a teacher, instructing 6th grade and AP biology at Basis Oro Valley, a position he has held for over a decade. By all public accounts from people who know him personally, he is described as a devoted husband, a dedicated teacher, and someone who suddenly found himself at the center of a national investigation connected to a deeply personal family tragedy. He has never been arrested. He has never been charged with a crime. And on February 16, 2026, the Pima County Sheriff's Department publicly and clearly announced that Shini and the entire Guthrie family had been cleared. That clearance is documented, it is official. And later in this video, it will be examined carefully and in full. But there are still elements of the timeline that remain difficult to reconcile. Because the Sheriff's Department itself confirmed that Shini was the last person known to see Nancy Guthrie alive. He drove her home after dinner. He waited while she went inside. He watched the garage door close. Then he left. 4 hours and 13 minutes later, Nancy's pacemaker stopped transmitting. 4 hours and 13 minutes is a significant amount of time, long enough for investigators to establish an alibi, long enough to verify someone's location through phone records, surveillance cameras, or witness accounts. When Sheriff Nanos announced the family's clearance on February 16th, he did not reference phone data placing Shini at a different location during the 41-minute window. He did not cite surveillance footage confirming his presence elsewhere. He did not identify a witness who could verify his whereabouts. Instead, the public statement simply said that he had been cleared. What it did not explain, and what no official statement has addressed publicly since, is how investigators eliminated him for the specific window between 1:47 a.m. and 2:28 a.m. That question has never been fully answered. And when you place that question beside the next detail, the gap between the official statement and the documented investigative record becomes harder to ignore. Because on that same day, February 16th, the day the family was cleared, the vehicle connected to Shini remained in a forensic evidence lot. It had not been returned. It had not been released. Investigators were still actively processing it. During a press conference, when Sheriff Nanos was asked directly about the vehicle, he chose his words carefully. Sheriff Nanos described the towing of the vehicle as part of standard investigative procedure. According to his explanation, it was consistent with the normal protocols used when processing a scene under court authorization. But there was something notable about what he did not say. He did not say that the car had been returned once the family was cleared, because at that time it hadn't been. On February 26th, 10 full days after the public announcement that the family had been cleared, crime journalist Brianna Whitney reported that the vehicle was still sitting inside the forensic evidence lot. It remained in custody. It was still being examined. When reporters asked the Pima County Sheriff's Department for clarification, the response was brief but revealing. Officials confirmed only one thing: the vehicle was still considered part of the active investigation. They did not say the processing was merely routine. They did not say nothing of importance had been found. They simply stated that it remained part of the investigation. Consider what that means in practical terms. When investigators clear a family member and a vehicle connected to them is only incidental evidence, something briefly examined during routine processing, it is usually returned quickly. Once the individual is cleared, the vehicle has no further investigative value. At that point, it goes back to the owner. That is the typical protocol. What does not typically happen is a vehicle remaining in a forensic evidence lot for weeks after a public clearance, while authorities simultaneously state that the vehicle is still tied to an active investigation. Those two positions don't naturally align without some reason behind them. Either the vehicle contained something investigators were still trying to interpret, a trace, a fiber, a fragment of forensic evidence, or it remained connected to a part of the investigation that the public clearance had not fully closed. Neither explanation was provided publicly, and neither has been addressed since. There is another detail that adds weight to the question. On the night of January 31st, Tommaso Shani did more than simply drop Nancy Guthrie off and leave immediately. According to the timeline confirmed by the sheriff's department, he drove the vehicle directly to her home, waited while she entered the residence, and watched as the garage door closed. That means the car was physically present at Nancy Guthrie's property on the same night she later disappeared. If investigators were attempting to determine whether any evidence from the property had transferred onto the vehicle, or whether anything connected to the events of that night had been carried away inside it, the extended forensic processing timeline would make sense. What remains difficult to explain is the lack of any public clarification after the family was cleared. Eventually, in early March, the vehicle was returned to Annie Guthrie. The forensic hold ended. On the surface, that might appear to resolve the issue, but the return of a vehicle after forensic processing does not indicate what investigators did or did not find. Authorities do not typically release that information publicly. The car was returned. What the weeks of examination revealed, if anything, has never been disclosed. That brings the first two details together into a single, unresolved question. The last confirmed person to see Nancy Guthrie alive has never had his alibi for the critical 41-minute window publicly verified or described. And the vehicle he drove that night remained inside a forensic evidence lot for weeks after he was cleared, eventually returned without any explanation about what investigators discovered during that time. 2 documented facts, 2 unanswered gaps, and neither one addressed directly by the official clearance statement. Every criminal investigation has a central thread, one question that investigators keep pulling to see whether the case begins to unravel or hold together. In this case, that thread runs directly through 41 minutes in the dark. A garage door closing, and a car that sat in an evidence lot long after the family had been told they were free to move forward. But those are only the first 2 details. Because while investigators were processing that vehicle, something else was happening across town, something that would bring law enforcement officers directly to another front door with evidence bags in hand. And they would remain there for nearly 3 hours. February 3, 2026. 3 days after Nancy, Guthrie disappeared from her home. By this point, the investigation was already moving at full speed. Search teams were combing the desert terrain. FBI analysts were reviewing digital evidence. The Pima County Sheriff's Department was holding press briefings, and more than 10,000 tips had already been logged. Publicly, the message from authorities remained consistent. No suspects had been identified. No persons of interest had been named. The family was cooperating with investigators. Then veteran journalist Ashley Banfield released an episode of her podcast. Banfield is not new to this field. She has spent more than 36 years in broadcast journalism, reporting for CNN, HLN, Court TV, and News Nation. Her career has included coverage of many of the most documented criminal cases in modern American history. On February 3rd, during her podcast Drop Dead Serious, Banfield cited a law enforcement source she described as highly credible, someone she had trusted for years, with direct access to the investigation. According to that source, two claims stood out. First, Annie Guthrie's vehicle had reportedly been towed, impounded, and placed into evidence, and the source suggested it might have some connection to Tommaso Schiene. Second, the source indicated that Schiene might be considered a potential prime suspect. Banfield was careful with her wording. She repeatedly used qualifiers. She emphasized that families are often examined first in cases like this, and she made clear that the information she was sharing represented a developing line of inquiry, not established evidence. Still, the name was now public. The following morning, the Pima County Sheriff's Department responded. In a statement issued to TMZ, officials rejected the claims. They said no suspect had been identified. They did not confirm the seizure of the vehicle, and they stated they were uncertain about the source of Banfield's information. During a press conference on February 5th, Sheriff Nanos described the reporting as reckless, but he also made another statement that stood out. He said that, at that stage of the investigation, nobody had been formally eliminated. Those were his words, nobody had been eliminated. Two positions now existed side by side. A veteran journalist citing a trusted law enforcement source on one side, and the sheriff issuing a public denial on the other. From the outside, it looked like a simple contradiction, one person right, the other wrong. But what happened over the next several days made the sequence more complicated. On February 7th, day 7 of the investigation, Savannah Guthrie appeared in a video message alongside her siblings Annie and Cameron. They addressed whoever might be holding their mother. The message was calm and deliberate. They said they had received a communication. They said they were willing to talk, and they said they were prepared to pay. Statements like that are rarely made casually. In kidnapping investigations, they are usually coordinated with hostage negotiators and FBI crisis response teams when certain conditions suggest that communication with a potential abductor may exist. Only hours after that video was released, another development occurred. That same evening, at least 3 deputies from the Pima County Sheriff's Department arrived at the home of Annie Guthrie and Tommaso Schiene. 3 unmarked vehicles pulled into the driveway. Inside the house, lights were dimmed and the window shades were drawn. Journalists stationed outside reported seeing bright, rhythmic flashes coming from inside, consistent with crime scene photography. Then one detail stood out. As one deputy left the house, he was photographed carrying a white hardshell case, the type commonly used to transport forensic equipment. When he had entered the residence earlier, he had carried the case inside. But when he exited, he was also holding a brown paper evidence bag. Former CIA officer and FBI Special Agent Tracy Walder later explained the significance of that combination in an interview with People magazine. The white case typically contains evidence processing tools. The brown paper bag is used to transport collected evidence. CBS News, citing 2 law enforcement sources familiar with the investigation, later reported that investigators believed they were developing useful information from the search. Much of the activity reportedly focused on the garage of the home, the same garage located roughly 4 miles from Nancy Guthrie's residence. Deputies remained inside the house for nearly 3 hours, according to multiple news crews covering the scene. Shortly after 10:30 p.m., the final deputy left. One of the evidence bags was placed into the back seat of an unmarked vehicle. Then the vehicles drove away. Publicly, however, the official position from the Pima County Sheriff's Department remained unchanged. No suspect had been identified. But the sequence didn't end there. 3 days later, on February 10th, the Sheriff's Department released another public statement. Investigative activity at the Guthrie residences, they said, would continue overnight and into the following day. The language was specific. Not concluding. Not wrapping up. Continuing. That statement came 6 days before the family was publicly cleared. To a forensic investigator examining the timeline from the outside, that sequence raises questions. First, a journalist reports that a law enforcement source has named a specific individual. Second, the sheriff publicly denies that claim. Third, investigators move toward that same individual's residence, conduct a multi-hour consent search, remove items as evidence, and later state that investigative activity will continue. And then there is a 6-day gap between that commitment to continued activity and the eventual clearance. Inside that 6-day window, the results of what investigators collected during the search, whatever forensic processing took place, whatever evidence was analyzed, have never been publicly disclosed. On February 16th, the announcement came. Clear. The entire Guthrie family, including spouses, had been cleared. But the statement contained no explanation. It did not reference what had been collected. It did not describe what forensic testing produced. It did not say whether anything recovered during the 3-hour search was examined and ruled out. It simply presented the conclusion. In science, in journalism, and in law, a conclusion without the method behind it is not verification. It is simply a statement. There is another detail that has received very little public attention, but belongs in the documented timeline. When investigators conducted the consent search at Annie Guthrie and Tommaso Shini's home on February 7th, they also returned to Nancy Guthrie's own residence during that same weekend. There, investigators were photographed examining the septic tank in the backyard. Authorities have never publicly explained why. In a kidnapping investigation, searching a septic system typically means investigators are looking for biological evidence of a very specific kind. The fact that this search occurred the same weekend as the 3-hour search at Annie and Shini's residence, and only days before investigators publicly committed to continuing activity, adds another layer to the investigative timeline. And again, no official statement has addressed it. Now, it is important to present both sides of the documented record. The search of Annie and Shini's home was consented to. They allowed investigators access without requiring a warrant. That is documented cooperation. People attempting to conceal involvement do not typically open their homes and allow forensic teams to examine their garage for hours. That point matters. It deserves to be acknowledged. But cooperation and unanswered questions are not mutually exclusive. Someone can cooperate fully with investigators and still leave unresolved questions about what evidence collected during that cooperation ultimately revealed. And those questions, specifically what investigators found inside that garage and what the forensic analysis of the February 7th search produced, have never been publicly answered. From February 3rd to February 16th is 13 days. 13 days from the moment journalist Ashley Banfield publicly mentioned Tommaso Shini's name to the moment investigators formally cleared the family. During those 13 days, investigators moved toward him, searched his residence, examined his garage, announced continued investigative activity, and then issued a clearance without explaining what those investigative steps had uncovered. That is not speculation. It is a documented timeline. And timelines do not disappear simply because a clearance statement is issued. At this point, 4 details sit on the table. The last confirmed person to see Nancy Guthrie alive. The vehicle that remained in a forensic evidence lot for weeks. The 3-hour search and the investigative sequence surrounding it. And another detail the clearance statement was never meant to address. The cameras. Because whoever disabled those cameras did not just know where one of them was. They appeared to know where all of them were. When investigators first said the camera had been disabled, many people imagined a malfunction or accidental damage. But the forensic record shows something much more deliberate. The Google Nest doorbell camera mounted at Nancy Guthrie's front entrance was physically disconnected from its power source at 1:47 a.m. on February 1st. This particular device, a second-generation Nest doorbell, contains a small amount of onboard flash memory designed as a backup. When the power was cut, the device did not instantly erase its data. Instead, the footage shifted to a local storage state and was later pushed to a deletion queue on Google's servers, where residual data remained until it would eventually be overwritten. The person disconnecting the camera likely believed the recording had been destroyed. It was, and that mistake gave investigators the clearest visual evidence in the case. But the action itself reveals something important. Disconnecting a doorbell camera from its power supply is not something that happens accidentally. Someone has to know the device is there. They have to know where the wiring or mount is located, and they must intentionally reach out and disable it. That action suggests planning. It suggests knowledge of the property. Now consider another claim that emerged during the investigation. According to the law enforcement source cited by Ashley Banfield, more than one camera may have been disabled that night. Not just the doorbell camera at the front entrance. Multiple security points around the property. If that account is accurate, it suggests the person moving around the house knew exactly where each device was located and addressed them one by one. That is not the behavior of someone randomly targeting a house. That is the behavior of someone acting on prior knowledge. There are only a few realistic ways someone could obtain that kind of information. The first is familiarity with the home itself, someone who had visited repeatedly and noticed the placement of security devices. The second is deliberate surveillance from outside the property over time, studying the camera locations from different angles. The third possibility is that someone provided the information directly. Now add another reported detail. In late February, a report surfaced that one of the images released by investigators had been captured on a different day than the others. According to a source cited by Fox News Digital, the masked suspect may have approached Nancy Guthrie's front door before the night she disappeared. CNN also reported that in one of the images, the individual was not carrying the backpack, suggesting the footage might have come from a separate occasion. The sheriff's office pushed back on that interpretation, saying the images did not contain visible timestamps and that speculation about a prior visit could not be confirmed. Both positions remain on record. But if a prior visit did occur, the forensic significance would be clear. It would mean the individual seen at the door had already approached the property once, possibly to observe the camera placement, evaluate the layout, and plan a later return. Former FBI profiler Mary Ellen O'Toole later analyzed the suspect's behavior captured in the footage. She did not interpret the actions as clumsy or impulsive. Instead, she described them as controlled. The suspect first attempted to block the camera with a gloved hand. When that didn't fully conceal the lens, he stepped away, gathered plant material from the garden, and used it to cover the camera from below. According to O'Toole, that response suggested someone who encountered a small obstacle and adjusted calmly without losing control of the situation. It was a correction, not panic. Investigators canvassing the surrounding neighborhood also asked residents to review security footage for the entire month of January, not just the night Nancy disappeared. They specifically requested footage from January 11th, roughly 3 weeks earlier. Authorities have never publicly explained why that particular date mattered. But when investigators ask for a 30-day review window, it usually means they are attempting to reconstruct a timeline that may extend weeks before the crime itself. Another detail investigators began tracing involved the gun holster seen in the footage. During a press conference, Sheriff Nanos mentioned that the holster appeared to have distinctive characteristics. Investigators reportedly visited gun shops across the Tucson area in an attempt to identify the manufacturer and trace possible purchases. A distinctive holster can be easier to trace than a backpack or mask. If investigators match the design to a specific product line, they may eventually be able to connect it to a purchase record. That line of inquiry remains part of the investigation. Then there is the physical description released by the FBI. Male, approximately 59 to 510 tall. Average build, a black mustache visible beneath the mask. The description is broad, intentionally so. The footage used to generate it had been reconstructed from partial data recovered from back-end servers after the original recording had been interrupted. It was not pristine video. It was recovered evidence. The description by itself does not eliminate anyone. Millions of men fit that general profile. Law enforcement has never publicly stated whether Tommaso Shini's physical characteristics were compared to the FBI's analysis during the clearance process, or whether that comparison resulted in a match or exclusion. The clearance was issued. The physical comparison was never explained. Another investigative lead also surfaced. Security footage from the neighborhood reportedly captured a suspicious vehicle in the area roughly 20 days before Nancy disappeared. Investigators were working to identify it as of mid-February. That detail, combined with reports of a possible earlier doorbell visit, the systematic disabling of cameras, and a distinctive holster being traced, suggests that planning may have begun weeks before February 1st. Someone prepared for this. Preparation requires knowledge. Knowledge requires access, either direct access to the property or information provided by someone who had it. And somewhere within that intersection lies the identity of the person who stood on Nancy Guthrie's porch in the early hours of the morning. But there is one more piece of evidence that many people believe closed the case against family involvement entirely. The DNA. Most people heard a single headline. DNA results came back and the family was cleared. Case closed. Except that is not what the forensic record actually shows. When investigators examined Nancy Guthrie's home, they did not recover a single clean DNA sample from one individual. What they found was a mixed DNA profile, genetic material from more than one person layered together at the recovery site. Sheriff Nanos confirmed this on February 19th when speaking to NBC News. And C.C. Moore, the chief genetic genealogist at Paraben Nanolabs, one of the most respected forensic DNA labs in the United States, responded to that information publicly. Mixed DNA profiles, she explained, are common in situations involving physical contact during a struggle. She did not describe the sample as contamination. She did not dismiss it as incidental. She described it as common under those circumstances. That single word, common, changes how the DNA evidence in this case should be understood. And it brings us to another piece of evidence that has been widely misunderstood throughout the investigation. The gloves. Approximately 2.5 miles from Nancy Guthrie's residence, investigators discovered a glove. And not just any glove. The FBI confirmed that it appeared visually consistent with the gloves worn by the masked individual seen in the doorbell footage. At first, that seemed significant. Preliminary DNA testing revealed an unknown male profile. That genetic sample was submitted to CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, a national database containing DNA records from convicted offenders and individuals arrested under certain state statutes. The result came back quickly. No match. The sheriff's department then issued a statement that confused the public and has been misunderstood in coverage ever since. They confirmed two things. First, the DNA recovered from the glove did not match anyone in CODIS. Second, it did not match the DNA recovered inside Nancy Guthrie's home. Two negative results. Two completely different DNA samples. And that distinction is critical, because it means investigators were not working with one unknown genetic profile. They were working with at least two. One associated with the glove recovered miles away, and another recovered inside Nancy's residence. Whether those two DNA profiles belong to the same individual or two entirely different people has never been publicly confirmed. Then a new development changed how investigators viewed the glove entirely. By early March 2026, both News Nation and CBS News independently reported that the DNA found on the glove had been traced, not to the masked suspect, not to anyone connected to the case, but to a restaurant worker employed at a nearby establishment. Someone with no documented connection to Nancy Guthrie. No apparent motive. No investigative relevance. The glove, investigators determined, had likely been discarded casually near the roadside. Authorities collected it during their search of the surrounding terrain, tested it, ran it through CODIS, and even pursued genealogical analysis. Eventually, the trail ended. A dead end. Understanding what that means is important. The glove that initially appeared visually similar to the suspect's gloves, the one that generated days of speculation about a potential DNA breakthrough, was not connected to the crime at all. According to the sheriff's department, investigators collected approximately 16 gloves from across the surrounding area. Many of them had been dropped or discarded by search volunteers working through the terrain during the early days of the investigation. The glove found 2 miles away was simply one of them. It was never the key piece of evidence many believed it to be. And now that the DNA on that glove has been identified and resolved, it no longer plays a role in the investigation. Which leaves the evidence that does matter. The mixed DNA profile recovered inside Nancy Guthrie's home. That sample is still being analyzed. It contains genetic material from more than one person. Sheriff Nanos acknowledged this directly. He said investigators believe they may have the suspect's DNA inside the home. The word he used was may. The analysis, he explained, was not complete. But he also made something very clear, something that received far less attention in headlines than it should have. He said the DNA recovered from inside the residence was far more important to the investigation than any glove found miles away. And that leads to a question that has never been fully clarified. When Sheriff Nanos said the DNA did not match anyone in the Guthrie family, what exactly did he mean? Because in forensic terms, that statement could describe two very different scenarios. Scenario 1 is straightforward. Investigators collected a direct DNA reference sample from Tommaso Shini. They submitted that sample to the lab, alongside the genetic material recovered from the crime scene. The lab conducted a direct comparison, and the two profiles did not match. That would represent a definitive biological exclusion. If Shani's DNA was directly compared to the material recovered inside Nancy's home, and the profiles are different, then scientifically speaking, he could not have deposited that particular genetic material at that location. That is clear, conclusive evidence. Scenario 2 is very different. Investigators run the unknown DNA profile through CODIS. The system returns no match. Because none of the individuals being considered have criminal records, none of their DNA profiles exist inside the federal database. And investigators then state that the family has been cleared. But a CODIS, no hit, does not eliminate individuals who have never had their DNA entered into the system. Someone with no arrests, no convictions, and no prior law enforcement processing would have no profile inside the database at all. Tommaso Shani has no criminal record. His DNA would not appear in CODIS. So a no match there would tell investigators nothing about him. It would only confirm that the unknown DNA does not belong to someone already recorded in the federal system. The Pima County Sheriff's Department has never publicly clarified which of those two scenarios actually occurred. They confirmed the family was cleared. They referenced CODIS and the absence of a match. But they did not publicly confirm whether Shani's DNA was ever directly compared to the mixed DNA sample recovered from Nancy Guthrie's home. That distinction, arguably the most important forensic question in the entire case, remains unanswered in public statements. There is another detail that investigators have never fully explained. An internet search conducted before Nancy Guthrie disappeared. Someone searched for Nancy Guthrie's home address. And they also searched for Savannah Guthrie's salary. Fox News confirmed that search occurred. What has never been explained is when exactly the search happened or who conducted it. Investigators have not publicly identified the device responsible for that search, nor have they disclosed whether it has been linked to any specific individual. But a pre-crime internet search for a victim's home address is not a minor detail. It suggests prior interest, possibly prior planning, and it connects directly to the same question raised by the security cameras. The question of knowledge. Someone knew where that house was. Someone may have researched it. Someone may have prepared. Meanwhile, the DNA recovered from inside Nancy Guthrie's home is still being processed. Samples have been sent to a private laboratory in Florida for further analysis, operating alongside the work being conducted at the FBI's lab in Quantico. Investigators are also pursuing investigative genetic genealogy through Paraben Nanolabs. It's the same firm whose analysis helped identify Brian Koberger in the Idaho College murders, using only a partial DNA profile and family tree reconstruction. C.C. Moore, Paraben's chief genetic genealogist, has spoken publicly about the process. She said she has full confidence that genetic genealogy will ultimately identify the contributor of the DNA recovered in this case. Not if, but when. In a case where every investigative lead, from cameras to backpacks to ransom notes, has taken time to unravel, the DNA inside that home may be the one piece of evidence that cannot be debated away. DNA does not rely on speculation. It either matches or it does not. And when that result arrives, it could answer more questions than every press conference since February 1st combined. But there is still one layer of this investigation that DNA alone cannot resolve. A senior law enforcement source, someone described as having direct access to the forensic results, surveillance analysis, witness interviews, and evidence processing, made a claim early in the investigation. Through a veteran journalist, that source stated that Tommaso Schiene may be the prime suspect in Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. Then the family was cleared. But the source never changed their position. Not once. And that leaves a final question hanging over the investigation. Why? Because in investigative journalism, when a source retracts a statement, it is a major event. It means the original information was wrong, the interpretation changed, or new evidence shifted the direction of the investigation. But when a senior law enforcement source watches an official clearance be issued and still does not move, it raises a different possibility. It suggests they still believe the original assessment is correct. On February 3, 2026, journalist Ashley Banfield reported on her podcast Drop Dead Serious that a highly connected law enforcement source had told her Tommaso Schiene may be the prime suspect. She used careful language. She emphasized that families are always examined first in missing person investigations. She described the source's comments as musings rather than confirmed conclusions. But the source was real. The information was specific. And the name was made public. The Pima County Sheriff's Department quickly denied the report. Sheriff Nanos called the reporting reckless during a February 5 press conference. The department told TMZ they had no idea where the claim had originated. Two opposing narratives were now sitting in public view. One from an official spokesperson, the other from a source inside the investigation. Neither one backed down. On February 12th, Banfield appeared on with Mediaite founder Dan Abrams. Abrams asked her directly whether anything had changed. Had the source updated their position? Banfield's answer was precise. She said her source had stood by the original reporting every single day since it aired. And she added something that has received very little attention. According to the source, after the report became public and Schiene's name entered the national conversation, scrutiny inside the investigation actually tightened. Not loosened. Tightened. In other words, public attention did not push investigators away from that line of inquiry. According to the source, it intensified it. That is a significant claim. Because a source who realizes they made a mistake typically corrects the record quickly, especially someone in a senior law enforcement position. But Banfield stated publicly that no correction ever came. In fact, she noted that several details from the source's early information were later independently confirmed. Multiple outlets verified that the vehicle connected to Schiene had been seized and held in an evidence lot. Fox News Digital confirmed that investigators recovered small fragments of glass beneath the front camera, suggesting the device may have been physically broken rather than simply removed. Banfield pointed to those confirmations not as proof of the source's conclusion, but as proof of the source's access. Someone who knew about the vehicle seizure and the camera damage before they were publicly reported was clearly receiving information from inside the investigation. And that raises another question. If the source was wrong about Schiene's status, why didn't they correct it after the family was cleared? A simple call could have changed the record. But according to Banfield, that call never happened. The senior law enforcement source who first identified Tommaso Schiene as a potential suspect stood by every element of that original reporting: the car, the cameras, the assessment of Schiene's status, without modification. Let's be very clear. This does not establish that Schiene was involved in Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. It does not override the sheriff's official clearance. It does not create an arrest, a charge, or a verified finding. What it does establish is that a highly positioned investigator, with direct access to the forensic results, the surveillance, and the witness statements, formed a specific conclusion about a specific individual, and maintained that conclusion publicly for over 4 weeks, even after the official clearance was issued. This fact exists in the public record. It has never been explained, addressed, or contradicted by any source of comparable rank or access. Officially, on February 16, 2026, the Pima County Sheriff's Department issued a public clearance. The statement was explicit. All members of the Guthrie family, including siblings and spouses, had been cleared as possible suspects. This was not hedged or qualified. The clearance reflected a process, not merely a press conference. Sources reported as early as February 14 that investigators were already moving away from the family as suspects. The family had consented to a warrantless, 3-hour search of their home, fully cooperating with investigators, and had posted a $1 million reward for information leading to Nancy's recovery. Savannah Guthrie also made public appeals, speaking directly to the person holding her mother, appealing for her safe return. This documented cooperation reflects behavior consistent with victims rather than perpetrators. At the same time, investigators pursued alternative leads. On February 10th, FBI Director Kash Patel confirmed that multiple individuals were being investigated. That same evening, a delivery driver, Carlos Palazuelos, was stopped near the U.S.-Mexico border, his home searched, and then released without charges after cooperating. 3 days later, Luke Dolly, a convicted felon living 2 miles from Nancy's residence, was detained, his home searched, and released with no connection to the Guthries. Meanwhile, Dominic Evans, a musician and Tommaso Shini's bandmate, was wrongly targeted online by amateur sleuths, illustrating the real-world consequences of unvetted speculation. There was also a hoax. On February 21st, a California man, Derek Kalla, was federally charged for sending a false ransom demand to Nancy's family. He had no connection to the disappearance, and federal authorities acted swiftly, showing the scale and sophistication of the investigation. When viewed in full, these counterdetails paint a clear picture of the investigative landscape. The Guthrie family fully cooperated at every stage. The lead agency conducted comprehensive forensic testing, surveillance analysis, witness interviews, and evidence collection, and multiple alternative leads were pursued simultaneously. The public clearance was not arbitrary. It reflected a process rooted in evidence. The DNA analysis from Nancy's home is ongoing, the forensic genealogy is underway, and the investigation continues to pursue leads that extend far beyond the family. This is the full documented record, meticulous, multifaceted, and far more complex than any single narrative thread or headline could convey. Within weeks, a fraudulent ransom message was traced and prosecuted, demonstrating the caliber of forensic attention applied to every lead. ABC News sources briefed on the case reported that investigators were already leaning away from the Guthrie family before the official clearance was even issued. This documented countercase deserves equal weight alongside the 7 unresolved details, and it underscores a critical truth. If Tommaso Shini had no involvement, the personal and public cost to him has been significant. His name entered the national conversation on day 3. His home was searched. His car was seized and examined. Millions of strangers formed conclusions about him from incomplete information. His bandmate faced threats. That cost is real, and if Shini is ultimately cleared by forensic evidence, it must exist in the record alongside the rest of the investigation. The family can be innocent, and the questions can still matter. The official clearance can be genuine, and unresolved gaps can still be legitimate journalism. Both coexist. 33 days after Nancy Guthrie was taken, the mixed DNA profile from inside her home is still being analyzed. The holster trace is ongoing. Genetic genealogy continues. Somewhere within those results lies the answer that could reconcile the public record with the documented investigation. Until then, the questions remain. 33 days since the garage door closed at 9:50 p.m. on January 31st, 2026, and Nancy Guthrie's home remains silent. No arrest. No verified proof of life. Only the desert, the questions, and a family keeping vigil. Savannah, Annie, and Tommaso Shani, laying yellow flowers at a growing makeshift memorial. Let's bring all 7 documented details together, not to convict or speculate, but to illustrate exactly where the case stands. The last confirmed person to see Nancy alive drove her home, watched the garage door close, and left. His alibi for the 41-minute critical window, 1:47 a.m. to 2:28 a.m., has never been publicly verified. His vehicle spent weeks in a forensic evidence lot after the family clearance, returned with findings that remain undisclosed. Investigators conducted a 3-hour consented search of his property, removed evidence, and continued investigative activity at the location before issuing a clearance 6 days later, without publicly explaining the search results. Meanwhile, the masked individual who took Nancy knew the placement of multiple cameras and disabled them systematically, knowledge suggesting familiarity with the property layout. The FBI's physical description of the suspect is broad, and it has never been reconciled with this individual's profile. DNA evidence cited to clear the family does not clarify whether it was a direct comparison or merely a database search, which tells us nothing about those not in the system. And a senior law enforcement source with direct investigative access identified this person as a possible prime suspect on day 3, and has stood by that assessment ever since, even through the official clearance. 7 details, all documented, all unresolved, all in the public record. As of March 5, 2026, the investigation is far from dormant. FBI agents returned to the Catalina Foothills neighborhood for renewed door-to-door canvassing. A new joint task force has been formed, including 4 dedicated detectives and a sergeant from the Puma County Sheriff's Homicide Unit, now embedded at the FBI Tucson field office. These are the department's sharpest, most experienced investigators, working exclusively on this case, with access to federal resources a county office cannot independently deploy. Sheriff Nanos told NBC News this week that investigators are definitely closer, not possibly, not hopefully, definitely, to resolving the case. He personally believes Nancy Guthrie is alive, a statement reflecting what he is reading inside the investigation, spoken with careful consideration to a national audience. A missing piece, the suspect's cell phone, is under active analysis. Cell tower data has already helped eliminate individuals and focus threads within the investigation. Historical location data could precisely place a device within meters, creating evidence that cannot be explained away or dismissed. Meanwhile, the FBI is reviewing approximately 10,000 hours of video footage from the surrounding area: Ring cameras, Nest cameras, commercial surveillance, dash cams. Each frame is being reviewed in real time, with enhancement tools applied to footage captured at the limits of resolution. Every lead, every detail, every frame is being meticulously processed, as the investigation continues for the long game, patiently building toward the moment when these unresolved pieces will finally provide answers. A neighbor's Ring camera captured a vehicle speeding through the area around 2:30 a.m. on February 1st, just 6 minutes after Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker went dark. That footage and the vehicle are still under active analysis. Almost every forensic thread in this investigation has raised more questions, except one: the glove. That lead resolved cleanly to a restaurant worker with no connection to the case. Every other thread remains open. The mixed DNA inside the home still being processed. The holster traced through Tucson area gun shops. Cell tower data still under review. The backpack and Walmart records actively examined. The suspicious vehicle seen 20 days before the disappearance still being traced. And a prior porch visit, confirmed by Fox News and CNN, contested by the sheriff's department due to missing metadata. These are active leads, and each, when resolved, will either answer a question or raise a new one. There are 5 critical questions that remain publicly unanswered. 1. What is the verified alibi for the 41-minute critical window? 2. What did the 3-hour consented search of the garage produce? 3. Was a direct biological comparison conducted between a specific individual and the mixed DNA recovered inside the residence? Or was the clearance based on a database search that would not detect someone with no prior criminal record? 4. Does the physical profile of the last confirmed person to see Nancy alive match or contradict the FBI's forensic description? 5. Why does a senior law enforcement official with direct access still maintain their original assessment despite a public clearance? These are not speculative questions. They are logical outcomes of the documented record and have been sitting in the public record since February. They have yet to be addressed. On day 24, Savannah Guthrie posted a video that captured the nation's attention. She said every hour, minute, and second since her mother was taken had been agony. She spoke of hope but also fear that her mother may already be gone, home with the Lord she loves. Then she delivered words aimed not at the public but at someone specific. If you have been waiting and you have not been sure, let this be your sign. Please come forward. Tell what you know. Help us bring our beloved mom home. Savannah knows the difference between a public appeal and a private one. 2 decades in journalism have taught her the power of deliberate language. This was a targeted message to someone who has information, someone weighing the cost of silence against the cost of truth. If you have information about what happened to Nancy Guthrie, there are 2 ways to act. Puma County Sheriff's Department tip line, 52350-1149. FBI tip line, 1-800-CALL-FBI. The Guthrie family has committed $1 million in cash, anonymously, no questions asked, for actionable information. 1 tip, 1 call, 1 person deciding truth matters more than secrecy could make all the difference. The masked suspect on doorbell footage remains unidentified. The mixed DNA inside the home is still being processed. Cell tower data continues to be analyzed. The FBI task force in Tucson is following threads the public cannot see. Sheriff Nanos has said investigators are closer than ever. The science is still running. Somewhere in Tucson or beyond, someone knows exactly what happened in those 41 critical minutes. 7 documented details, 5 unanswered questions, and 1 woman who deserves to come home. This case is not over. This channel is not done covering it. Subscribe and hit the bell. When the DNA results arrive, when the cell tower data is processed, when the next break comes, you will get it here first. With the same forensic precision, verified sourcing, and rigorous standards that have guided every chapter of this investigation. Nancy Guthrie is still out there. The answers are still coming.